Imagine this. You're a young mother in the spring of 1453, inside the once invincible city of Constantinople. For more than 1,000 years, these walls have stood as the guardian of Christendom, shielding its people from countless sieges. But now, those ancient stones tremble with every thunderous strike of Ottoman cannons. The air smells of smoke and despair. 3 days ago, your husband died defending the ramparts. His last words still echo in your mind, but you have no time to grieve, because now you hear the sound of splintering wood. Turkish soldiers are breaking down your door. You clutch your baby girl tightly, her small cries lost in the chaos, and deep down, you already know what comes next will make your husband's death feel like a mercy. For over 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire stretched its power across 3 continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. We remember them for their monumental architecture, the gleaming domes of the Blue Mosque, the mathematical elegance of their calligraphy, and the legendary skill of their armies. Their sultans, from Mehmed the Conqueror to Suleiman the Magnificent, shaped the destiny of nations. But buried beneath those stories of grandeur lies a different history, one that was carefully hidden behind the polished marble of empire, a history of conquest not just through battlefields and sieges, but through the calculated domination of human lives themselves. Before we go deeper, if stories like this, forgotten, uncomfortable, yet vital, fascinate you, consider subscribing and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It truly helps us bring more of these uncovered truths to light. When Ottoman armies claimed victory, their conquest didn't end at the fall of city walls. That's where another, quieter campaign began, one not driven by rage or chaos, but by cold administrative precision. What followed wasn't to the uncontrolled violence of war, but a methodical system, documented, regulated, and repeated across hundreds of captured towns. Historians who've studied Ottoman military archives describe it not as random plunder, but as a process, refined over generations, a process that weaponized the most personal parts of human existence. When Constantinople finally fell on May 29, 1453, Sultan Mehmed II didn't allow his soldiers to simply loot and leave. The fall of the Byzantine capital triggered what internal Ottoman manuals referred to as the harvesting protocol. To the conquerors, this wasn't an act of revenge, it was logistics. To the victims, it was the apocalypse. Byzantine witnesses described scenes that could have only come from nightmares, streets filled with screams, churches aflame, the air thick with ash and terror. Yet in Ottoman records, those same horrors appear as routine reports, organised lists, tallies and ledgers, all written in careful bureaucratic handwriting. The procedure began with grim efficiency. Every male over the age of 12 was marked for execution, not amid the chaos of battle, but after surrender in orderly groups. The reasoning had nothing to do with combat, it was a preemptive policy. Boys as young as 6 were sometimes killed if they showed signs of defiance or strength. The Ottomans had learned that leaving male survivors, even children, could lead to future rebellions. Their goal wasn't destruction, it was control, and that control began by erasing all who might one day resist. But for the women, the suffering took another form entirely. Ottoman military law, codified in documents still preserved in Turkish archives, outlined exact procedures for what they called population processing. It sounds clinical, but what it meant in practice was the systematic sorting of captives based on gender, age, and perceived worth. It happened not in secret but publicly, often in open squares beside still-burning churches or shattered city halls. The purpose was psychological as much as practical. The message was clear. Resistance ends not only in death but in total subjugation. Young women, typically between 14 and 25, were labelled the most valuable. Ottoman registries from the fall of Constantinople record over 4,000 in this category, each assigned a number and an estimated market price. These weren't nameless masses to the administrators. They were inventory, catalogued like livestock. Each entry reduced a life, a story, a person, into a commodity. The next group, women aged 25 to 40, were deemed fit for labour. They would serve as domestic workers or field hands within the empire's territories. Those older than 40 were categorised as non-viable, a cruel term meaning they were executed alongside the men. To the Ottoman administration, it was a cost-saving measure. Feeding and transporting them, officials argued, wasn't worth the expense. Children were handled under separate orders. Boys younger than 6 were taken for the Dev Shirma, the empire's infamous system of forced recruitment and conversion. They would be raised as Muslims, trained to serve as soldiers, administrators or janissaries, their old identities erased and replaced with loyalty to the Sultan. Young girls, meanwhile, were absorbed into what Ottoman documents called formation programs, a euphemism for preparation and conditioning, often leading to placement in elite households or within the imperial harem system itself. Every step of this process was designed to break the spirit of the conquered. Families were forced to witness the sorting, watching loved ones divided into categories they didn't understand. Mothers saw their daughters tagged and led away, knowing they would never see them again. Children cried for parents who could not protect them. The psychological warfare was deliberate. Every scream, every tear was part of the mechanism of control. By spreading despair through spectacle, the Ottomans ensured that news of such horrors would travel faster than their armies, weakening resistance long before the next siege began. This wasn't the chaos of war. It was a strategy. An empire that rose on the strength of its armies also understood the power of fear. To rule for 600 years required more than military might. It required the breaking of wills, the remoulding of societies, and the rewriting of memory. The fall of Constantinople wasn't just the end of Byzantium, it was the beginning of an era in which conquest became an institution, administered with the same precision as any state function. And for that young mother, standing in the ruins of her home, clutching her child as soldiers stormed in, history would never record her name. To the empire, she was only one of thousands processed, categorized, and erased. Yet her story, like countless others, survives in fragments, whispered through the pages of chronicles and preserved in the shadows of the empire's own records. They remind us that beneath every glorious empire lies a foundation built not only of stone and steel, but of suffering, silence, and human cost. Imagine standing in the ruins of a fallen city, your cries drowned by the noise of soldiers shouting commands. The smoke still rises from the churches, and amid the chaos, a new kind of cruelty unfolds, one not born of battle, but of calculation. Eyewitnesses from Constantinople recount moments that defy comprehension. Ottoman soldiers tearing infants from their mothers' arms, not to eliminate threats, but to shatter spirits. Babies crying in terror were often silenced in an instant, not out of mindless brutality, but as a demonstration of absolute control. The message could not have been clearer: resist and watch everything you love be destroyed before your eyes. Within just 2 days of the city's fall, an entire population was systematically processed through the Ottoman machine of conquest. Roughly 50,000 people were catalogued, separated, and assigned to their fates with chilling precision. 12,000 women and girls were loaded onto ships bound for the slave markets of Bursa, Ankara, and beyond. Another 8,000 were distributed among the conquering soldiers as part of their reward, living trophies of victory. Nothing about this was random. Every number, every shipment, every allocation was recorded. The empire functioned on documentation, not chaos. What the world remembers as plunder, the Ottomans recorded as commerce. Because that's what this was, an industry, a massive, organized enterprise that treated human beings as units of trade. Ship manifests from that time reveal the truth written in ink and numbers. These weren't poetic descriptions or exaggerated tales, they were business records. A typical entry might read, 20 bolts of Damascus silk, 40 units of pepper, 15 females aged 16 to 20 years, excellent condition. The same lines that listed spices and fabrics also listed people. The women had no names, only ages, physical notes, and appraisals of worth. It was the language of the marketplace, applied to human life. And the system didn't stop at the walls of Constantinople. It extended across the empire, from the markets of Istanbul and Edirne to distant provinces along the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. Specialized districts were established in major Ottoman cities, where human beings were auctioned beside livestock and fabrics. Pricing structures varied according to demand. A young Greek or Balkan woman might fetch 20 to 30 silver coins in Istanbul. African women, brought from Nubia or the Horn of Africa, were priced according to their origin, complexion, and perceived rarity. Every aspect of identity was reduced to an entry in an economic formula. The Ottomans hadn't invented slavery, but they perfected its organization. They turned what earlier empires had done in chaos into a disciplined, regulated system. Their bureaucracy maintained detailed inventories, bills of sale, shipping manifests, tax records, each treating human life as cargo. Surviving documents in Ottoman archives describe these transactions with the same tone used for trading textiles or metals. Human suffering became paperwork, quantified, tabulated, archived. And perhaps most chilling of all was how this system sustained itself. Success in Ottoman campaigns wasn't measured only by captured fortresses or conquered territory. It was measured in bodies, the number and quality of people seized. Commanders received bonuses based on how many captives they produced. Each campaign, therefore, created an economic incentive to target civilians. The empire's expansion was as much about capturing populations as it was about seizing land. This policy produced a psychological effect that military strategists understood well. Entire cities, upon hearing what had happened in Constantinople, chose surrender over resistance. Why fight when resistance promised not just defeat but the complete dismantling of your family, your identity, your humanity? Fear became the empire's most powerful weapon, more effective than cannons or cavalry charges. Word of Ottoman processing spread faster than their armies, breaking morale before the first arrow was fired. For the women who survived the sorting, the next phase of their ordeal was transportation, a journey across land or sea that stripped away the last remnants of who they once were. The ships that carried them to the markets of the empire were not ordinary vessels. Maritime studies have revealed how these ships were specially modified for human K. The holds were fitted with ventilation shafts, water storage and crude waste channels, not out of compassion but efficiency. Their purpose was to preserve as much of the cargo as possible until arrival. To the empire's accountants, every life had a price tag, and every death was a financial loss. These ships were prisons drifting across the sea. The women aboard were stripped of everything: clothing, jewellery, even their names. They were issued coarse garments marked with identifying symbols or numbers. They were forbidden to speak their native languages, sometimes punished for even whispering to one another. This wasn't just physical captivity, it was psychological warfare designed to erase their sense of self before they reached the markets. Survivors' accounts, few as they are, describe voyages that lasted weeks under unbearable heat, filth, and starvation. Some women threw themselves into the sea rather than endure it. Those who died from disease or exhaustion were tossed overboard, their deaths noted in the ship's records like spoiled goods. Ottoman administrators viewed a 15% mortality rate as acceptable, a cost of doing business. It was a calculation, not a tragedy. By the time these women reached the ports of the empire, from Izmir to Cairo, they were no longer seen as individuals. They were processed goods. Their fates varied depending on where they were sent. Some were purchased by wealthy families as domestic servants, others were selected for the Sultan's household or the harems of provincial governors, but in every case the process was the same: depersonalization, control, profit. This industrialized exploitation reflected an empire that saw conquest as a system rather than an event. Every campaign produced captives, every captive produced revenue. Even the bureaucratic language used in surviving Ottoman documents reveals a chilling detachment. Words like processing, allocation, and inventory used to describe human lives. The same officials who recorded tax revenues also recorded the number of captives delivered from newly conquered territories. It was an empire of paperwork and pain. And yet, the true horror wasn't just in what the Ottomans did, but in how efficiently they did it. Their system created momentum, self-sustaining, profitable, repeatable. Each new victory fed the machinery of the next. The more captives taken, the richer the empire became, and the stronger its military resources grew. The cycle was endless. For the people of Constantinople and the countless cities that fell afterward, this was what conquest meant. Not just the fall of walls or the loss of sovereignty, but the destruction of identity itself, the breaking of mothers from children, the reduction of human souls into columns and numbers. It was a pattern repeated for centuries, refined by bureaucracy, hidden by history, and remembered only in whispers. This wasn't uncontrolled savagery or the product of cultural misunderstanding. It was a deliberate system, policy by design, refined across centuries and continents, built to turn human beings into economic assets and tools of domination. The brutality had purpose. It wasn't just about conquering land, it was about conquering the human spirit. Through this machine of power, the Ottomans didn't merely subjugate populations, they reshaped them. They converted terror into law, and through that law, they legitimized the unthinkable. Because the true horror of Ottoman conquest didn't end when the fighting stopped. It began afterward, in the quiet aftermath, when survivors were absorbed into an administrative system that weaponized their bodies and identities. the empire institutionalized exploitation so thoroughly that it became part of the state's foundation. Its laws redefined morality itself. Rape became a form of marriage, murder became justice, and slavery was elevated to divine will. The archives of the empire, still preserved in Istanbul, Ankara, and Bursa, contain legal documents that outline, in chilling detail, how this system worked. Every act of abuse had a rule. Every violation had a form. What might look today like a crime against humanity was then recorded as a legal right. There was nothing accidental about it. It was the structure of empire itself. Central to this system was a legal concept known as the war wife. In Ottoman jurisprudence, when an enemy soldier was killed in battle, his widow was automatically transferred as property to the man who had slain her husband. This was not a casual custom or battlefield superstition. It was codified law, complete with procedures, witnesses, and time limits. The claiming process required 3 male witnesses and had to be initiated within 72 hours of the husband's death. If no one claimed the woman in that time, she could be contested or even auctioned to another warrior. Legal disputes over such claims filled Ottoman military court records, where women's lives were debated like pieces of disputed land or livestock. But ownership was only the beginning. To transform a captive woman into a war wife, the empire required more than paperwork. It required the erasure of her past. Names were the first thing to go. Women were forced to abandon their birth names and accept Turkish ones, often chosen by their captors or local clerics. A new name signified a new identity, a symbolic death of the old self. Then came religious conversion, the cornerstone of assimilation. Conversion wasn't offered as a choice. It was enforced through carefully choreographed ceremonies that combined humiliation, violence, and indoctrination. Public gatherings were staged where women were made to renounce their faiths, to spit on crosses, icons, or scriptures that once gave them meaning. Those who hesitated were punished in ways designed to break resolve while preserving their physical value. Pain was always measured against utility. The empire's obsession with efficiency extended even to convey. Dedicated centres of reformation were established in major cities, facilities designed to process and reshape conquered women. Archaeological findings from sites in Bursa and Edirne reveal structures with narrow stone chambers, drainage channels, and iron fixtures that hint at what occurred within their walls. These weren't temples of faith, they were factories of psychological warfare. Women were detained there for months, subjected to cycles of indoctrination, ritual, and systematic abuse meant to erase their cultural memory entirely. For 6 months, the typical duration of what records call formation programs, they lived in an engineered limbo between fear and obedience. Pregnancy was not an accident within this system, it was an instrument. The empire understood that biological ties could anchor submission more effectively than chains. Women impregnated during captivity were less likely to flee, more likely to comply, and easier to control. Their children, conceived in coercion, became living bonds tying their mothers to the empire's will. For those children, the nightmare only deepened. Infants born of mixed heritage were examined carefully. If they bore too strong a resemblance to their mothers, reminders of conquest too obvious to conceal, they were quietly eliminated. Officially, they didn't exist. Those who survived were absorbed into the empire's social structure, raised in ignorance of their origins. Their mothers' real names, languages, and histories were erased from every record. The child would grow up to serve the same empire that had destroyed its family. But the Ottomans didn't hide these practices. They broadcast them. Fear was a tool, and reputation was the sharpest blade. Reports of how conquered women were treated spread deliberately through borderlands. Captives released intentionally told stories of the conversion centres, the forced marriages, the ceremonies of humiliation. These accounts reached villages and towns far beyond the front lines, shaping perception before the first Ottoman soldier appeared. Entire communities would surrender without a single arrow fired, not out of respect, but out of terror. The empire's reputation for sexual domination became its most effective weapon of conquest. Even Ottoman chroniclers, the empire's own historians, recorded these practices with pride, not shame. They described how cities capitulated instantly upon hearing what had happened in others. Terror was framed as mercy, subjugation as civilization. To them, psychological warfare was proof of divine favor. Each conquered people, stripped of dignity and identity, was seen as further evidence that the empire's rule was ordained. And yet, surrender brought no safety. The Ottomans had learned that terrified populations were far easier to govern than those who trusted imperial promises. Submission didn't grant protection, it merely accelerated assimilation. Even cities that opened their gates voluntarily found their women subjected to the same processing as those taken by force. Every act of compliance was repaid with domination, justified as necessary for imperial security. Over time, this system hardened into doctrine. The empire's jurists and theologians interpreted the exploitation of conquered peoples as divine justice, a right granted to the victors. Entire sections of legal texts were devoted to regulating sexual access, ownership, and inheritance for women captured in war. In this way, the Ottoman state embedded human exploitation into its moral and legal identity. The machinery of conquest didn't stop with the battlefield. It continued in the courts, the mosques, and the administrative offices. Bureaucrats and scholars gave philosophical form to violence, turning cruelty into order and domination into destiny. And somewhere within that system, among the countless forgotten names, were thousands of women who once had families, languages, and faiths, now lost to hist. Ori, replaced by new identities the empire forced upon them. They were not only victims of conquest, they were its very foundation. The Ottoman Empire ruled not merely through soldiers and sultans, but through the calculated breaking of human will. An empire built as much from fear as from stone. Across the empire, exploitation eventually took on the shape of administration. What had once been improvised on the battlefield evolved into a formal system of tribute. This mechanism, known to history as the Dev-Shirma levy, is often remembered for the boys it claimed, Christian youths taken from their families and trained for service to the Sultan. Yet hidden within the same framework was another, lesser-known dimension, the organised seizure of girls. Their stories seldom appear in chronicles, but Ottoman fiscal and military records confirm their existence. The process followed the same legal logic as the levy on boys. Officials travelled from village to village, recording names, ages, and physical descriptions. Families could plead, bribe, or hide their children, but resistance risked punishment. For the boys, there was at least the distant possibility of advancement. Some rose to become administrators, scholars, or soldiers in the elite Janissary Corps. The fate of the girls was different. They vanished into closed institutions where their labour, and sometimes their very identities, were absorbed into the empire's domestic and dynastic machinery. Archival documents show that a large proportion of those taken never survived their first year in captivity. Disease, exhaustion, and mistreatment claimed many lives. Ottoman clerks noted these losses with chilling detachment, recording percentages and replacement quotas as if managing livestock or inventory. Those who lived were drawn into regulated programs intended to sustain the empire's population of servants and attendants. These programs were tracked through meticulous registers that listed age ranges, health assessments, and even fertility statistics. Reading those records today reveals an empire that applied mathematics to misery. Administrators calculated the ideal ages for collection, the most efficient routes for transport, and the cost of maintaining captives compared with their expected years of service. Every element of human experience, birth, labour, illness, and death, became a variable in an equation designed for imperial profit. The language of the documents is coldly technical. Phrases about productive years or resource efficiency appear where one would expect compassion. It exposes how a culture of bureaucracy can normalise the unimaginable once it is reduced to paperwork. Economic incentives reinforced the cycle. Military officers who returned from campaigns with high numbers of captives were rewarded with promotion or additional land. Merchants and contractors who delivered fit and healthy individuals to urban markets gained access to lucrative imperial monopolies. The result was a feedback loop of exploitation. The more the system rewarded capture, the more it demanded new victims. And so the machinery of abduction spread far beyond official wars. Ottoman raiding parties conducted seasonal expeditions into border regions, timed with agricultural calendars and weather conditions. These operations were planned like harvests. Scouts mapped villages months in advance, noting population sizes, resources, and potential resistance. The goal was not destruction, but acquisition. Routes were drawn to yield the highest number of captives while avoiding major military clashes. For those living along the frontiers, the rhythm of life became intertwined with fear. Each year, as spring gave way to summer, families braced for what they called the harvest time, not of crops, but of people. Folk songs, prayers, and even calendars marked the weeks when the risk of raids was greatest. parents took desperate years to protect their children. Some disguised them as younger or older than they were. Others hid them with relatives deep inland. Over generations, certain communities resorted to self-defacing traditions. Scars, soot, or crude garments, meant to make young girls appear less noticeable to raiders. It was an act of love distorted by terror. Village architecture adapted to this new reality. Archaeologists have uncovered cellars with concealed tunnels, secret chambers beneath barns, and fortified watchtowers, disguised as granaries. These were not military structures, but family shelters, built to hide women and children when the alarm bells rang. Yet even these measures rarely succeeded for long. Ottoman intelligence networks were extensive. Local collaborators or coerced informants revealed hiding places, and captives who resisted were tortured until they yielded information. What began as protection often turned into tragedy. Over time, entire cultures reshaped themselves around survival. Customary laws evolved to prioritize communal safety. Curfews during raiding seasons, marriage rituals tied to protection oaths, and village councils responsible for defense strategies. Oral traditions across the Balkans, the Caucasus, and parts of the Middle East still carry traces of that era. Stories about midnight alarms, about mothers hiding children under floorboards, about the dread of hooves on distant hills. These cultural memories outlasted the empire itself. The scale of this trauma is visible not only in folklore, but also in demographic records. Regions repeatedly targeted by tribute collections and raids experienced dramatic population declines, particularly among young women. Economic patterns shifted as labor shortages forced communities to reorganize agriculture and trade. In some areas, gender ratios became so distorted that social norms about marriage and inheritance, hanged entirely. What began as an imperial policy of extraction ended up rewriting the cultural DNA of entire provinces. What makes this history even more unsettling is how transparently it was documented. Ottoman scribes, trained in the language of order and administration, recorded every step without apparent shame. The ledgers that detail these practices sit beside tax rolls, military rosters, and census books, evidence that to the empire, the capture of human beings was simply another branch of governance. To them, this was administration, not atrocity. Historians reading those pages today encounter a tone devoid of emotion, filled instead with the vocabulary of efficiency, quotas, yields, transport costs, projected lifespans. It is the voice of a state that had learned to separate morality from management. Through these records we glimpse how systems of domination endure, not because individuals are uniquely cruel, but because cruelty becomes procedure, repeated until it feels ordinary. And so, long after the cannons of conquest fell silent, the bureaucracy of captivity continued its work. The empire's institutions, its treasuries, its courts, its local governors, functioned as a vast apparatus for turning terror into policy. Each line of ink across those centuries-old pages stands as quiet testimony to how completely human lives can be reorganized when power learns to measure people as numbers. The empire's records reveal something more chilling than individual cruelty. They expose a system so meticulously organized that exploitation itself became an administrative science. Among the most disturbing archives are the breeding registers, ledgers that tracked the reproductive capacity of enslaved women across vast imperial territories. These weren't rough head counts or simple inventories, they were detailed databases, written in elegant calligraphy, that monitored conception intervals, birth rates, and maternal survival statistics with a precision usually reserved for state finances. One who survived the ordeal of capture and transport were catalogued, assigned identification codes, and relocated to specialized facilities designed for controlled reproduction. The empire's architects even standardized blueprints for these structures, complexes that appeared from Anatolia to the Balkans, each with identical geometry optimized for supervision and control. Narrow corridors linked rows of cells, allowing guards to watch every movement. Central courtyards served as regulated exercise yards, ensuring captives remained healthy enough for childbearing. Every element, from window placement to ventilation shafts, was calculated to preserve order and compliance. These facilities were equipped with medical wings, not out of compassion, but to protect imperial assets. Surviving Ottoman medical texts describe procedures intended to sustain pregnancies and reduce infant deaths, written in the same technical tone used for veterinary manuals. Physicians in service to the state developed methods for increasing conception rates, turning biological processes into tools of empire. Births, miscarriages, and maternal deaths were all documented, cross-referenced, and filed under fiscal categories that treated human lives as measurable output. Inside these centres, women were classified and ranked. Age, physical strength, and fertility determined access to food, medicine, and relative comfort. Those deemed most productive were kept under careful supervision and given limited privileges. Older women or those who failed to conceive were reassigned to grueling labour camps, where harsh conditions quietly eliminated the unprofitable. Efficiency governed every decision. Mercy had no administrative value. But domination wasn't achieved through confinement alone. The empire perfected psychological control with the same precision it applied to architecture and medicine. New captives were systematically broken through deception. Officials showed them forged documents and staged reports claiming that their families had died or their villages had been burned. The purpose was not simple cruelty, it was erasure. Women who believed there was nothing left to return to were less likely to resist. Their despair became policy. Ottoman administrators invested heavily in maintaining these illusions. They learned that despair required no chains. A mind convinced of its total isolation policed itself. Through this manipulation, the empire achieved the ultimate economy of control, obedience born from hopelessness. The children born within these facilities entered the system already categorized by gender and potential. Boys who displayed strength or intelligence were separated from their mothers at a young age and absorbed into imperial institutions, educated, trained, and remade into instruments of the state. Girls, meanwhile, were assessed for their physical suitability and either placed into domestic servitude or prepared to continue the same cycle of reproductive exploitation. The separations were deliberate and cruelly timed. Mothers were forced to watch as their children were taken away, an event that served both logistical and psychological ends. Loss created dependence. Women stripped of maternal bonds often became emotionally reliant on their overseers, which reduced resistance and escape attempts. What began as an act of violence evolved into a mechanism of governance. Across generations, these practices dissolved the basic fabric of family. Entire lineages vanished into state registers, their origins erased and replaced with imperial designations. What the empire built wasn't merely a system of enslavement, it was an entire social order sustained by the systematic destruction of kinship. This was not an isolated aberration of wartime cruelty, nor the chaotic excess of conquest. It was a deliberate, institutionalized system that endured for more than 6 centuries, administered with the same bureaucracy that managed trade, taxation, and law. Its traces survive not only in human memory, but in the empire's own archives, records so precise that they testify against their creators. The ledgers, the architectural plans, the medical treatises, all of them bear silent witness to a civilization that transformed exploitation into governance and suffering into policy. Together they reveal an uncomfortable truth, that the machinery of empire can make even the unthinkable seem orderly, even rational, when power is absolute and conscience is absent.